Welcome to the Organisational Inclusionist. I'm your host, Grace Masuro. In this podcast series, we'll be delving deep into the pressing issues surrounding equality, diversity, and inclusion in both the workplace and the broader world. My goal is to foster understanding, inspire change, and amplify the voices of those advocating for a more inclusive and equitable society. Throughout this series, I'll be engaging in candid discussions with leaders, experts, activists, and changemakers from various fields. We'll explore the challenges, successes, and evolving landscapes of equality, diversity, and inclusion. From dismantling systematic biases to promoting equal opportunities for all, we'll touch on a broad range of topics. But we won't stop at discussing problems. We'll actively seek out solutions and actionable steps to drive positive change. Our aim is to inspire and empower you, our listeners, to take an active role in making the world a better place for everyone. This is the Organisational Inclusionist. Let's get started. Hi everyone, welcome to today's episode of the Organisational Inclusionist. My name is Grace Masuro and I am your host, and today I am joined by the wonder that is Sia. I will get Sia to introduce herself properly in a moment, but Sia is an educational and child psychologist, and I met Sia at an event a couple of months ago now, I think, and firstly she's gorgeous, in case you can't see. But she's just when you just warm to someone, like really approachable, genuinely interested in what you have to say, and she's doing absolutely amazing things. So we caught up after we'd met. We had a video call, a video chat, and she was saying some really interesting things about her work and just why it's important, particularly in education, when we think about Black children, but also just children from marginalized backgrounds to some extent. So I had to have her on. So Sia, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. And I just felt very drawn to you when we met at that event. So all of the things that you said about me, it's because you're a mirror and you're all of those things too.
Thank you. The love fest.
Yeah, total love fest.
I love this. So Sia, I would love it if you could please introduce yourself to any of our listeners. Who is Sia and what do you do?
Thank you. So I'm Sia Mangaza. I'm an educational and child psychologist, but sometimes I flip that around and say I'm a child and educational psychologist, depending on the emphasis of my work on that particular day. I also lecture, so I teach on a doctorate program for trainee educational psychologists. I do bits of research, and then I also work as an educational psychologist in local authority, as well as doing some really interesting offshoot things like I work with a charity for Black women's mental health, and talk about the psychology of different areas and how it impacts with Black women's mental health. So I'm lucky in that I've got a variety of things going on in my work.
Amazing. So Sia wears many hats, in case you haven't guessed. But yeah, I think the biggest thing for me hearing all the things you do is, when do you rest?
Oh my gosh, you know what? It's so interesting because I think that the more I've progressed in my career, I've been doing educational psychology for 5 years. I feel as though the more specialized I become and the more I move into my work, the more I've kind of infused what it is that I need to do. So within my day-to-day job, I still need to do a lot of reading and looking at the evidence base. And when new things come in, I need to kind of make sure that I am competent in what I'm about to deliver or hold space for. But actually, I feel as though the more specialized my work becomes, the narrower my diary becomes. I know that sounds paradoxical, but I feel as though the years leading up to my training and during my training were the busiest. And now I have a bit more freedom to make work-life work for me.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, that is very good news. So what's the story behind the work you do? What sparked your passion for psychology and education?
Yeah, so I love that question. I think I became really interested in psychology so my mum used to buy these magazines called Psychologies. I don't know if you remember that magazine called Psychologies, but it was back in the day when buying magazines was a thing, like where you would go and look at your magazines and be drawn to the thing with the nice toy on it or whatever. I was doing that while my mum was like getting her stuff. And there was one that she used to buy called Psychologies. And it was just mad interesting. I found it really cool, some of the things. So that was when I was in my teens. I started to become interested in the idea that there is an area of thought which is just about people and how they think and the reasons that they do stuff. So I knew I was going to select it for A level. And then when I started studying at A level, I just geeked out. I was so, I think I was an annoying classmate because I was that person that always had loads of questions, that always was putting their hand up, whether I was right or wrong. I was fully engaged. But I could feel that there was like an energy around psychology for me. That dipped when I went into my undergraduate degree. I felt a little bit more detached from psychology. It changed in nature at undergraduate level. It
Mm.
becomes a little bit more statistical in focus. And to me, I felt more detached
Yeah.
from the people that it's meant to be about. So I became a little bit disillusioned with it. And I also was, as many like young Black students at that time, early noughties, was starting to think about these inequities in the way that I was experiencing my educational journey and the other people that I was meeting from different
Mm.
class backgrounds and places at university. So all of that kind of pulled me away from psychology to some degree, but I became interested in like educational pathways. Why am I experiencing this so differently
Mm.
from somebody else? And one day, I can't quite remember how it happened, but I realized that these two sort of interests, the psychology that gives me the energy, the educational questions that are causing some curiosity, there was a pathway in between those, which was educational psychology. And then I built up lots of work experience working within education because I loved working with children, and then moved more towards educational psychology eventually. So that's my kind of story. But just going back to another one of the, I think, pivotal things that pushed me towards this career, it was one of my school experiences. And I went to a very like racially, ethnically diverse school in inner city Birmingham, and I was in the top set for English, and we had an assignment to do, which was to write about the way that misogyny showed up in a 50 Cent song. And our teacher
Mm.
had given what I felt was a quite one-sided lesson about rap and rappers as represented by 50 Cent in the song PIMP. And so I wrote what I thought was an absolutely banging assignment in response to this.
Mm.
And I talked about like women rappers and the ways that women are represented in older forms of rap, and 50 Cent's background with his own mom. I got deeply psychological in this essay, I would say. But the teacher who marked my work, accused me of plagiarizing the work and didn't believe that I'd written the work.
Mm.
It was because I was the only Black girl in the top set. There was no reason for her to assume that about my work. It was in
Yeah.
keeping with the rest of what I was doing. But because I was in a bit of trouble at the time at school, I didn't feel that I could like advocate for myself around that. And so there was something about that being one of my disempowering experiences that stuck with me, that made me think about, I knew what was wrong in that moment. I had the language for it. I could talk
Mm.
to my parents about it. But I just knew that would not be the case for a lot of people. And that put a bit of a bee in my bonnet around how we can disempower children in our
Mm.
educational processes. So those experiences, I think, drew me towards what I'm doing now. Yeah.
Amazing. It's so funny, not funny, but I had a similar experience in
Did
secondary school as
you?
well, but it wasn't to do with a piece of work. I was in the top set for maths and I loved maths.
Mm,
But my maths teacher was a nightmare. She was one of those ones that if you made a mistake in class, she'd call you stupid. Her language towards kids
mm,
really frustrated me.
mm.
And I had a massive savior complex when I was growing up. So I was always the one that had to say something.
Yeah,
So I was always telling her about herself, like,
yeah.
that's inappropriate. You shouldn't say that, this, that, and the other. So she hated me with a passion.
Mm, mm,
There weren't that many Black girls. I think there was me and two other Black girls in the class of 30.
mm, mm.
but the other two girls were a lot better behaved than me in the sense that they didn't challenge her.
Interesting.
And she just basically decided she didn't like me and she wanted me out of the class because I challenged her. My work was on point. I was where I was meant to be. But then one day, one of the girls in class was being naughty. I still remember it to this day. The teacher had on this like beige linen summer dress. And every time she turned around to write on the board, this girl, because we used to have Parker fountain pens in those days, and this girl used to she was flicking the pen, all the ink, down the back of the woman's dress. And by the end of the lesson, like the woman's dress was covered in ink and no one said anything. And she didn't find out until she got to the staff room and they told her. And she told the head teacher it was me. She was like, it was Grace. And no, it was Grace. I didn't even have a fountain pen in those days. My mom couldn't afford Parkers. But she was adamant it was me and she got me kicked out of the class. So I got moved down to the middle step. And at the time, I didn't realize how significant that move was going to be on my academic journey.
Interesting.
But because of that move, I couldn't sit the higher paper, which meant the most that I could score in GCSE was a B for maths.
Right.
Then meant that because I only got a B, I couldn't do maths A level at sixth form.
Right.
I wanted to do maths A level.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that until it was time to apply for A level.
Yeah.
I was like, wow, this woman completely pooed on my trajectory. And she didn't know what she was doing.
I
had no idea. My mum, was like, I moved to the UK when I was 5. So my mum didn't have any understanding of the education system. She couldn't advocate for us in that way. And she was very much about like just keeping quiet. But I think it's so important to emphasize that just how important it is for us to highlight the inequities that still exist in education, the discrimination that exists, and how that can impact people's life journeys, because teachers have so much power in their hands.
Oh my God.
It's very important that they use it well.
Absolutely.
I'll never forget that teacher.
Were you I don't know if you were like me, but I was looking for my teacher on LinkedIn and just wondering if I could be like, hey, I made it.
No. Because I always knew she was miserable.
That's the healthy response, I think.
She was miserable. When I tell you, that woman was miserable. And I don't think that she will have done anything great after she left our school. Like, she wasn't there by the time I did my GCSEs. Not GCSEs, because I stayed for sixth form. So by the time I was in sixth form or finished sixth form, she'd gone. So I don't know where she is. Wish her all the best. But yeah.
It's interesting though. When you say that you weren't aware of the implications of being moved down a set, this is still a prevalent issue, especially for not just Black families, but for families that are getting used to the language of education. So when I was doing my own doctorate, I did some research with Black families about their experiences in education. And one of the things that came up as a theme, as it was a smaller theme in the wider frame of the research, but it was a thing. It was about the change in language from ABC and to like numbers and a different grading system, and the ways in which people, when those changes were introduced, either understood or misunderstood those changes, and the implications of that understanding or misunderstanding was big. But then also there was a couple of stories where young people were saying that they didn't realize that by getting predicted a certain grade would impact their choices at A level, their choices moving forward. So actually, like, when we think about these, interpersonal interactions in the classroom, they can have massive implications for your life trajectory and for your life journey. So it's really important, I think. Yeah,
definitely. And this conversation has reminded me that I need to send an email to my daughter's school. But so you've worked across different spaces, from tutoring doctoral students to research with the Education Endowment Fund. What have you observed about how equity, or the lack of it, shows up in education today?
That's a really good question. I think in general, there are these like very tangible and then quite intangible ways that inequity shows up in education. But I think for for me as an educational psychologist, I'm often thinking about the children who are, for whatever reason, struggling with school or in need of like a bit of additional support. Within that, there are inequities, as you could imagine. And I think one of the biggest queries, concerns, proven areas of inequities around which children get specialist support in schools, and also how children with additional needs are viewed. So we know from years and years and years and years of data that we have a problem around systemic racism in schools and how that impacts exclusion for Black children. What is becoming way more apparent, and I think it's becoming a lot more spoken about, is the idea that children's behaviours are constructed and understood differently. So for a child who's struggling with attention and concentration, for one child it might be looked upon as an attentional or a memory difficulty, and for a Black child it might be seen as defiance. So it really is about the practitioner and how they are understanding and viewing those children. And I suppose the ways in which I feel we as educational psychologists, but also just as educators, people invested in children's education, can make a difference in that is kind of looking at the data. So in the last psychology service I worked in, we did a really interesting project where we analysed the data around who was being referred to which service and what was the reason. And we did find those discrepancies, and we found those inequitabilities. I don't even know if that's a word, but I'm going with it. But when you look at your data and you can see, okay, we've got children who might be presenting with similar needs, but the white child was saying it's communication and interaction, and the Black child was saying it's social, emotional, and mental health needs or behavioural needs. If we've got the data to say this is happening, we can develop a tool. So we developed a tool where we could speak to people who were doing referrals to our service about these inequities and help them to go on a journey around how they understood the children in their own setting. So for me, it's about who gets to see specialist services. Every service that is attached to a school, not just educational psychologists, I'm talking about like paediatricians, community nurses, specialist teachers, all of these people have years of practice and specialism. They can help to understand something that can just unlock a child's educational journey if they're doing their job well. But not everybody has the gift of seeing those people or having that walking on that journey with those people if they need it. So that for me is one area where there is inequities. And then I suppose on the flip side of that, to add a bit of nuance, it's about maybe over referrals to pathways that are damaging. We talked earlier around choices that can change your trajectory. And I think that actually once a young person has a lens on them in terms of their behavior, it can create an ecosystem where they're kind of seen in a certain way and start to accrue exclusion, and then that can equally have a negative impact. So I think it's balancing the way that we understand children and what they're showing to us. Yeah,
absolutely. So based on your research and practice, do you believe our education system is equipped to truly support children from marginalised communities? And if not, what do you think is missing?
Well, that's a really good question. So I think it can be, and I think that this is why it's important to stick with it, because I think it can be, and I've seen how it can be done well. I've seen how schools can be really honest with themselves about the nature of schools, the nature of the data about what tends to happen and discrepancies around achievement and exclusion. And they work with that information. So I know that it can be better. One example of how that has worked, we talked about maths earlier, and I worked with a really lovely school once who came to me and said, like, we are failing our black girls in maths. We've looked at the data and it's telling us that we need to do something about it. And so I was able to then look at like what's happening in the classrooms, what's the evidence base saying, and I came across stuff that was really interesting around the way that adults tend to construct the knowledge of young black girls, and that can impact the way that they're taught maths and all of that kind of thing. So I think that when schools have that understanding and that knowledge and can work with you on it, it can be great. And then I think it's also about representation within schools and within specialist services, not just representation for representation's sake, but people that know and understand and can relate to parents, can relate to the children, and can again, like unlocking different gifts and knowledges about how their educational journey can become better. So I think it can work better. At the moment, it's not working as well as it could. Yeah, but it can be better.
No, I agree. So we talked, when we caught up last time, we talked about some of the work that you're doing around technology and AI. How does race, class, or neurodiversity impact the way children and families engage with technology in learning?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So yeah, I was involved in doing some data collection on a research project around the ways that EdTech is being used in schools, particularly for children that are struggling with their learning or identified as disadvantaged learners. So that under that umbrella, lots of learners will come under that umbrella. And I suppose one of the key things was around just the money, the tangible. If we're thinking about literal hardware and children who are from poorer backgrounds, are we like meeting that inequity by providing hardware to continue that learning at home? So that was one of the key things. I think also when we're thinking about neurodiversity and EdTech, and I think it's around the way that we're understanding what works for a range of different learners. Because if you are using EdTech simply as an extension of the tools that you're already using, if there's somebody that learns differently, it's not going to work for them if it's not been adapted for them.
Exactly.
So some of the teachers that we were speaking to in this research project were actually saying things like, we should start to explore EdTech tools and materials for their inclusivity, for their accessibility, and we should actively patronize the companies that are accessible, and we should leave the rest out. So I think that those things are there and are prevalent. I also would say if we're thinking about like gamified learning, which is quite popular, it's around like how relatable the games are. If there are characters, how much children can see themselves in those characters. So there are a range of things really when we think about EdTech and diverse learners. But actually, if education is already inequitable, the last thing that you want to do is embed a tool that gets rolled out and just simply compounds those inequities. The reason why I was interested in being in this research was it was because we were thinking about the fact that any tool can kind of replicate a difference or an imbalance. So how do we make sure that we're not doing that?
Exactly. Thank you. I know AI is the future. And it's one of the things that I'm very conscious of is AI as it stands is very, very biased. And I'm really concerned about the more and more organizations are using that for things like recruitment and progression. You're compounding an already biased system because there are so many biases that sit within AI. So really looking at actually what part can I play in changing that. So I love that you said that. I completely agree. When we talk about AI and bias, we usually focus on data, but what does psychology bring to the table in terms of addressing bias and building more ethical AI?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think that certainly in terms of educational psychologists, we're very much at the infancy of understanding how we can be in the arena, I would say. The second thing I would say is that psychology as a whole has its own inherent biases. So psychology isn't a silver bullet when we think about reduction of bias. But I
Mm,
would say that there are some kind of, there are some useful psychological lenses like confirmation bias, the idea that you'll have some hypotheses in mind and any evidence that you seek will confirm those. Yeah. So I think that psychological theories like that can be useful in, shaping the AI landscape. And then I think the other thing that psychologists could potentially bring, but it doesn't have to be a psychologist. I think it could be anybody that has a lens on vulnerable people or disempowered groups like children can be sometimes. It's around your ethical framing. So we have to have like these ethical standards that we work by and adhere to, and so we have a language to think for talking about ethics and for thinking about things like informed consent and for thinking about things like data. And so I think we can bring some of that to the table in terms of our lived experience and our practice as well.
excellent. So, do you think AI has the potential to widen or close gaps in education? I feel like I kind of already know the answer,
Mm.
but to widen or close gaps in education and inclusion, and what's the risk if psychologists aren't in the room?
Yeah. So I think that it could do, but it could go either way. I think that technology, EdTech in general, can, reduce some disadvantages. There's some data to suggest that it can reduce some disadvantages, but then there's that it's complex because we're at the very early stages of that research, and there's some data that suggests that it compounds disadvantages. Um,
Mm,
so I think that it can go either way. I think the things that we need to be thinking about are the wider systems around children. So as we talked a little bit about things like hardware, but actually I think often about um, the space that teachers have to do their job and to do it really well. And I think one of the things that came up in the research project was around the implementation practices um, around EdTech, or when I say EdTech, I'm kind of including AI in that. So if we are able to provide the space to train teachers effectively, to think about how they can embed their pedagogy into their use of EdTech, to think about the ways in which disadvantage already shows up in their classroom and how EdTech can be a bridge to bridge some of those disadvantages rather than kind of like inherently compound them. I think that that's really key. And I think speak to teachers kind of know, a lot of teachers do know and can do their job really well if you kind of give them the space to problem solve around,
mm,
okay, here's the space to think about what's going on in your classrooms. Here's the technology. How are we going to best use this, and how are we going to measure our effectiveness over time? And I actually think that is a top-down problem. That's not something that individuals can solve. I think that this is an issue that goes right to the top of government, where we're thinking about how well-resourced schools are to move forward with the technological age that we're finding ourselves
yeah,
in. So, yeah.
amazing. If we could design, or if you could redesign one aspect of the education system tomorrow, what would it be?
I feel as though I would be giving schools, teachers, teaching assistants, who I don't think get enough credit in this kind of like educational landscape, I'd be giving them a lot more time to do things like reflective practice. When I worked in a school, I was teaching for a while before going into educational psychology. I didn't have the opportunity to do what we have to do as psychologists, which is we have to do supervision, we have to do, peer supervision. Supervision has a different kind of connotation in the education world, but in psychology,
Yeah,
it's about thinking through the ethical connotations of our actions, all of those decisions that we talked about at the beginning of the podcast around moving somebody down a set. What are the implications of that? What does that mean for that child's race and class and all of that kind of thing? I don't think that there are enough spaces within schools for teachers to kind of do that reflective practice together. I would be creating an education system where we can create those spaces for teachers. I would also be, and this isn't just about schools, I think this is about like the wider society. I'd be reframing what we think of in terms of accessibility and inclusion. I think that as much as I love the work that I do, some of the work that I do is around supporting people to reframe what it means to have a diagnosis of ASD, autism spectrum disorder, or ADHD, or what a neurodiverse brain looks like in practice. And if we had space for people to really understand difference better, and if our education system were to judge children in a different way, in a more open way and a more creative way, I actually think that we'd have much happier children. We wouldn't have as much of a crisis as we're having at the moment around, we've got something we now call EBNSA, or I always get the acronyms wrong, but emotionally based school avoidance. So massive implications for young people and their mental health. But I think the systems that we push them through and the curriculum that we push them through absolutely works for a lot of children, but there are more and more children on the margins for whom that's not working for. So I think a reshifting, a reframing of what it means to achieve, to show up, to be your best, and to flourish, that needs to come from outside of the education system, but it really needs to permeate inside of it.
Absolutely. I know so many teachers, particularly at my church. I feel like everyone that goes there is a teacher. And whenever I ask them how's work, they're just exhausted. They're just like, and most of their time is spent on kind of admin, and it feels like they don't get the opportunity to do what they came into the space to do, which is spend time with kids and develop those children and really help them be the best that they can be. Because they're so caught up with what the system is demanding them do.
Absolutely.
And it's such a shame. I think if we could get back to the focus being on the children and on the child, things would be so much more powerful.
I always see teachers as like this absolute vault of knowledge, and I think the way that educational psychologists tend to work, we often our link to a school is somebody called a SENCO, like a special educational needs coordinator, and they'll have an oversight of lots of different children who have additional needs, but I always try to make space for consultation with teachers, and every single time I'm working with a child, I find that bringing together a parent and a teacher and saying, for this to go well, we need an hour and a half together to kind of hash things out. The wealth of knowledge, the kind of solutions that we can move towards, the idea of the child that we can like reframe and reconstruct, the aha moments that we can have from connecting mom's view to my view to teacher's view. So I think the luxury of our job as educational psychologists is that we have to say, if you want to work with us, we have to create the space for the teacher to come in, reflect, share, add their expert knowledge. And so, I think that's why a lot of teachers like end up going into educational psychology as well, because it's that difference in space.
I love that. What's the one thing that you want every listener, whether they're a student, an educator, a leader, a parent, to take away from this conversation?
I think that a lot of parents, if their child is struggling, or if their child ends up needing to access additional support, for some parents it can be really scary, and for some teachers who have children who are struggling, I think they can get really dismayed if they don't feel supported. I think that what I would say is, a lot of the time, what we're doing as psychologists, of course, we're adding in ideas and we're hopefully adding value from like an evidence base, but a lot of the time we're identifying what they're already doing with the child that's adding strength, adding love, adding value, and adding care, and we're just kind of putting words to that. So I would say, if you're in one of those really dark moments where you don't know what the next step is for your child, or you feel like they're struggling, or you don't know what's happening next, I would say take a moment, think about what it is that you are doing to provide routine, to provide love, to provide care, to provide structure, to provide gap boundaries. You're guaranteed to be doing some of those things, and it can help you just to know, like, you have a stake in this, and you can do this until you get the support that you need. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you. So I've recently started to close out the podcast with this question. What does inclusion mean to you in the education space?
I think that what inclusion means for me is the ways in which we can see each individual child in their most golden light. And so when I'm working with adults who are within a child's life, I'm often working with a few people from the school and maybe parents as well. I always open up the conversation by saying, what's the thing that they do that makes you laugh and smile the most? Because they're often in a place where it's heavy, and we just need to slice through that by humanizing each child that's struggling. So I would say that really, I would say that it's around thinking about those difficult situations and those hard moments, and just slicing through those in terms of, you know, what is it that the child does that connects with you and brings you joy, and from that place you can do some problem solving.
Love it. Thank you. So how do people connect with you, Sia?
Oh, so me and you had a conversation about LinkedIn, and me being a bit more present and talking about the work that I do, which is so varied. So I would definitely say finding me on LinkedIn is a good first step. I am Dr. Sia Mangaza on LinkedIn. I'm also on Instagram as well, Dr_CC. And then I'm on Twitter too, but less active. So I would definitely say LinkedIn or Instagram are the
Excellent.
best for
I
me.
will include a link to your bios. If you could send those to me,
Yeah,
please.
of course.
But thank you so much for joining me. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I've taken a lot out personally, and I hope our listeners will too. So thank
Thank you
you.
so much, Grace. It's really nice to speak to you today. Thank you.
You too.